A few people asked, hey, are you going to give like a little closing speech thing or whatnot? And I thought about it, and looking outside at my live camera, I was told like, hey, nobody has anything else better to do. So sure, let me say a few words about a few things and see what kind of trouble I can get into. Mary, you may want to leave the room for this. No, just kidding. I think it won't be too bad. So let me start with this idea. I'm not a big fan of labels, and people tend to like to label things. I'm not a huge fan of that as a general concept. The label that I'm sort of walking around with these days is CEO. I can't get much away from that one. It's kind of my job title. But I notice like here at Surge, we get a lot of different mix of people, and they'll ask like, are you a DBA? Are you a dev? Are you an op? Do you self-identify as one of those? And I think I used to raise my hand for those things, and I don't anymore because now I have this label. And so now I can't be those things. And that's sad, I guess, for me. Not for anyone who works at OmniTI. They're all very happy that I don't do those things. But for me, it's kind of sad. So as a CEO, another label that people say is, hey, you're an entrepreneur. And I don't tend to think of myself as an entrepreneur, although maybe I am. I don't know. I heard this sort of good explanation of what entrepreneurism is, or if you are an entrepreneur. And the idea was like, if you see a problem, right, you look at that problem and you think like, there's got to be a solution for that, right? And then it kind of bothers you to not have a solution, right? You sort of feel compelled to go make that solution. And I thought like, well, that actually does kind of describe me in a way that I could probably get on board with. So maybe as a label of entrepreneur, if this is what I think about it, like, yes, okay, I could be that. Because when I see problems, I tend to think like there's got to be a way to solve this problem, right? And I've definitely learned over the years, like, two of the best ways to solve problems, and in all credit, OmniTI really sort of helped drive this home for me. Cheating is definitely a good way to solve a problem, and brute force is another good way to solve a problem. And when you can put those two things together, like, that's great, right? That's a really good idea. So in that spirit, I thought, let's talk about hard problems that we have in computer science. Everybody knows there's only two hard problems in computer science, right? We only have one joke. That's definitely one of the hard problems in computer science. We probably should come up with more jokes. We don't have them, we should get them. And cache invalidation, right? I believe there was a Surge talk on this at least once. So that's a hard problem. And also off by one errors, right? Because we can't really decide zero-based arrays, one-based arrays, whatever. So of course what I'm going to talk about is naming things, right? Because that's also a hard problem in computer science, and one that we are really all bad at, as evidenced by more Surge talks this year. And I think like this isn't actually a computer science problem. I actually think this is a general problem. When I look at my name, right, Robert, it's pretty simple. But I know a number of people call me Rob, right? So even in my name, I don't really actually self-identify with either of those two. But I probably am more used to Robert than Rob. Just kind of depends. Some people actually call me Bob, like a very small, I know everyone's like, what, really? Like a small minority of people I know have called me Bob over the years. That's fine, that's not my name really. If you could say Bob, if you say Rob or Robert, I'll probably turn around. If you say Bob, maybe not. Like you'd have to be like a certain person. So names are hard in general. People try to like identify you by ways that make sense to them. Right, so people have asked me like, are you like the Jesus replacement now? You're taking over for Jesus and those kind of questions. And again, like that's kind of a little bit of a label when I look at that. Like, well, I'm not trying to be Jesus, right? If I was trying to be Jesus, I don't know, that might get awkward in a hurry. I've been called names like somebody like Jesus before, and it's not one that I would necessarily recommend. So not that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm just saying like, that's not my name. So that's not what I'm trying to be. That's not the label that I'm all about. So I think on a grander scale with computer science and names and labels and what we call things, and things that really kind of, I wish we just did a better job at, most of you would probably think I would pick on something easy, like NoSQL, right? Perhaps. NoSQL is an interesting term. So I looked on the Wikipedia one time, and as I understand it, the guy who invented the term is this guy, Carlos Strozzi. And way back in 1998, before they had NoSQL, I guess, he invented an open source relational database that just didn't have SQL, right? And so he would refer to that as his NoSQL open source relational database. And that actually made a lot of sense. Like, that wasn't really controversial. Everybody was like, okay, cool, I get that. But then some other people came along, and they said, NoSQL sounds like a great term. We know people hate SQL. I bet we could market the hell out of the NoSQL idea and apply that to just about anything. So they took it, and they made all kinds of different databases, none of them who had SQL, and then sort of put that out upon the world. And I would guess that many of you here have encountered these databases for one reason or another, even if you didn't want to. And the thing that kind of bugged me about this idea was it wasn't really the SQL was the thing that they were trying to solve, right? So if you look at these systems, they have, maybe not SQL, but they have SQL-like languages, right? I like to call the first one, it's pronounced Sparkle, for those who don't know, but I like to call it SparQL, because you fight with it. But if you use like Cassandra, there's like CQL. If you're in the Hadoop ecosystem now, there's like, this is just some of them, right? Like Hive and Spark and Impala and Hawk, and like they're all trying to put SQL engines on top of their NoSQL databases, right? And I sort of feel like the universe explodes when you put a SQL engine inside a NoSQL database, right? Like, or it should, because you told me that SQL was a horrible thing, and now you're trying to put a SQL engine in your database. It'd be like a database who told you like transactions and foreign keys were bad and then tried to put those in the database. Like, you'd question that, wouldn't you? Maybe that's just me. The thing was that the problem that they were trying to solve wasn't the SQL problem, right? They were looking at the CAP problem. And they were looking at relational databases who said consistency is important and we got to pick P, right? And they said, well, consistency is not that important. Let's go with availability as the primary thing that's important, right? And so they've sort of built these systems around the idea of we can't, we got to pick P, but we're going to go with availability, and we'll figure out the consistency later. And actually, I think that's a pretty valid model if you're trying to think about data storage and how you use it and why it matters. That's totally cool. I think the problem is that the no consistency moniker really doesn't sell as well as the NoSQL monitor, right? Like, it is actually what you're kind of trying to sell people, but like, I don't know. I haven't seen this on a T-shirt. Right. I've seen a lot of NoSQL T-shirts. I haven't seen the no consistency one on a T-shirt. So, but actually, I wasn't going to talk about NoSQL at all. So don't just ignore all that. That's not what I want to talk about. A thing I think is much worse in database terms that probably could be improved is the concept of big data. Right. So here's another term. Usually has to do with databases, and people think about databases and data. I'm not sure exactly like where we determine the cutoffs for this type of stuff. If I think of like a 4 terabyte Postgres database, right? Like we got one of these, everybody has one of these, right? Like it's fine. Throw a lot of data into it. Some people seem to lose all the data they throw in their Postgres, and then they come and they do search talks. That's fun. It's sort of funny. I was at a Postgres conference last week, and like none of the people here talking about all their destroyed Postgres were at that conference. And I don't know exactly what the correlation there is, but sort of feel like maybe some of these people need to go there or vice versa. I don't know. But anyway, so let's say you have a 4 terabyte Postgres database. If you're a DBA and you're a little bit old school, and you must be because you're using a relational database, you walk around and you tell people, yes, I have a 4 terabyte Postgres database, right? And you would say, like, that's not big data, right? Postgres isn't a big data system. It's just a relational database. So I just got data in there, all right? But really, if you think about it, if you're trying to sell Postgres as a, sort of big data system, and now that, it's got analytics and fancy queries and all that stuff, so maybe you would say, like, well, actually, I don't have a 4 terabyte Postgres database. I have a 4 terabyte master, right? Like, that's the one that all the traffic goes in. And I have a 4 terabyte slave for failover, and another 4 terabyte slave where we do, like, analytical queries, and they're sort of more expensive, so we put those on another machine, and probably another one for read-only queries, right? So really, it's not just one database that I have all these databases. And of course, we don't use the term master and slave anymore, right? So what I have is I have a queen, and then I have Aurora, Merida, and Bell. And they're all kind of doing their thing as appropriate, right? So when I look at all that, so now, well, maybe it's starting to be like real data, right? If I was thinking of my Mongo cluster, like I would probably calculate data like this. And of course, I should digress. We run everything on ZFS, so of course, when I say a 4 terabyte database system, it's on ZFS compressed, so it's actually like 7 terabytes on each of these machines, right? Like that's, so, maybe not on your operating system, but on mine. Anyway, so we have, a fair amount of data. So now we can talk about, I have a 28 terabyte big data system. And I'm not sure that's actually big data even yet, right? 28 terabytes, it's not small. Like, you actually need to put some operational effort into that. If I really wanted it to be a big data system, I wouldn't use a relational database who has thought about how do I store things compactly and try to like take advantage of that. I would store everything in plain text, right? And then just sort of be like, well, that's the universal interface, which would give me like maybe like a 50 terabyte big data system. And that would be great. I guess. I don't know. Is 50 terabytes big, right? Like, what is big? Some people would say, like, you need at least 100 terabytes, right? And those aren't the people who have, like, petabytes of data in their systems, right? And so, like many things in life, I would say, it isn't really the size of the data that matters. It's how you use it, right? That's what we're trying to talk about. We're talking about the analytics of the data. When people talk about big data systems, that's what they care about. Right? And so I try to sort of like take acronyms I don't like and just change them into something I can live with. So when I say big, I tell people, like, think about it like business impact generating, right? It's still marketing friendly, but it's sort of more accurate, you know? And I know that marketing and accuracy are not things that people tend to try to correlate to each other, but every now and then it gets on me. And so this is like one where I would say, like, hey, if you care about big data and you're really wondering what it's all about, this is what it's all about. Storing a bunch of data and being able to figure out how to use it for my business. But actually, like, this wasn't what I was going to talk about either, because, like, I don't do databases anymore, right? I don't self-identify as a DBA. So I wasn't going to talk about that. I was going to talk about something else that seems to impact my life a lot these days. That might also be controversial, and you'd wonder about that name. And of course, that is DevOps, right? We all hear this term all the time. DevOps totally is a thing. Right? You'll hear people talk about the way of DevOps, right? Like, maybe you heard this. If you go to any of the DevOps days, and I will admit, like, I sort of helped organize DevOps Days DC. Like, DevOps is a thing, you know, that I'm interested in and I think is useful. And so being in that community and knowing a lot of the people who were in there for a long time and having been involved with it for a long time, I hear people talk about this, and then people will come and ask me, and they say, like, hey, is Surge a DevOps conference, right? And I see tweets where people are like, what are the 10 best DevOps conferences? And when I see them put Surge on there, I'm like, well, that's weird. I don't know. Maybe it's not a DevOps conference. And when I don't see them put Surge on there, I'm like, well, why the hell don't they put Surge on there? Like, you should totally be going to that conference. That's way better, right? And so I have people ask me this question, and I don't know. Like, I guess it kind of depends, right? What is DevOps to you? What does it mean to you? And depending on what your answer to that is, like, you may or may not agree that this is a DevOps conference, right? Some people have a more visceral reaction to DevOps, right? They're a little bit sort of, I don't know, offended by the term at this point, maybe. Shock trauma is sort of a thing for them. And I don't blame them, right? Like, again, everyone has this notion of DevOps, and it's a little bit different. I usually tell people, like, I think DevOps is a journey, right? Like, if you're going to go down this path, and I don't mean like a sort of obscure 70s rock band that then got a singer and popularity and bad music. I mean, like, it's a path that you wander, right? Like, through the desert for 40 years, that kind of thing. And so you go on this journey and you sort of think about, well, what is DevOps and how do I break this down and what does it mean to me, right? And you look at those sort of two pieces, and this is what everybody does. They look at it and say, well, right, we have devs, we have ops, and I bet there's people here. Who here is not a dev or an op? Anyone gonna? Yeah, a few of you. Most of the devs and the ops people are left. So ops people know to look at traffic patterns before they leave. So anyways, okay, so you look at these two sides. You got devs and you got ops. And so the simple answer is, well, you're bringing development practices to ops, right? That was like sort of one of the first things that we heard about. And, you know, storing configuration as code and telling your ops people to learn how to script things, because ops people didn't know how to script things before like 3 years ago, right? And so giving them that knowledge, some of us sort of thought, well, maybe the better idea is like telling developers to make operable software, because like I don't see a lot of that out there in the world, right? And I'm totally on board with that as an idea. But whatever, right? So you start thinking about what these things mean. And like we do DevOps consulting at OmniTI, right? And when somebody calls us and says, hey, I've got a DevOps problem, can you help us, right? And the business guy always says, absolutely. What does DevOps mean to you, right? And because that's the first question you have to ask. Like, obviously you say yes first, like, yeah, we can help you, right? Like, that's not a question. Obviously, we're going to do that. But we don't actually know what you want yet, so we need you to sort of clarify that. And actually what we find is for most people, DevOps is basically just automation, right? That's all they're asking for. And their whole world sort of revolves around that concept. DevOps is automation. And I have to clarify, because some of you are actually technical, I would say, like Pat, I know for sure. So when I say automation, what I really mean is configuration management, right? Which is sort of not exactly the full scope of what automation could be, but it's usually the full scope of what someone who says DevOps is automation actually is talking about. And that's fine. So, okay, so automation, configuration management, for the rest of this talk, they're the same thing. Just go with that for a little bit. So the idea is like, well, if DevOps means automation to you, it's still actually incredibly valuable, right? And that's a key thing to understand. When you start automating processes, right, whether it's configuration management or other parts of the stack, that's still like super valuable for you, for your coworkers, for the companies you work at, right? The ability to actually produce more value with fewer barriers, like that's what everybody actually wants, right? It's what your boss wants, it's what you want. Whenever you can get that, you feel better in life, right? So if all you ever do is automate your stuff, right, and even if that's just putting configuration management on your servers, you'll be better off at the end of that, right? And so I see that. And I'm happy to help people get that far along in the journey, right? So again, it's a journey. You get that far, you've gotten somewhere, and your life is better than it used to be. And again, incremental improvement, it's a thing. But there's more to DevOps than automation, right? The more DevOps conferences you go to, right, and there are some that will gladly embrace that as a thing, the more of those you go to, the more you'll hear about this, right? And I don't disagree. I'll be so bold as to say, I have a friend, Adam Jacobs, works at Chef, has been doing DevOps for a long time, before it was called DevOps probably. And he sort of hammers home a point a lot, and I sort of agree with this, right? If you get the culture wrong, the tools don't matter. And it doesn't mean that the tools don't matter, right? It just means that like you can take good tools that are trying to help you do the right thing and stick them in an environment where it's just not going to work, right? Because the environment itself doesn't lend itself to becoming better. And I would agree with that, right? I've seen that in a lot of places. Again, as consultants, usually people don't show up to our door saying like, hey, I have a system with no problems, could you please fix it, right? Like it's always broken when they get there. And sometimes it's broken because it's a technical problem, and sometimes it's broken because it's an organizational problem, right? And so we can often go in and we'll start chefing things and then sort of realize like, this is not gonna solve everything because chef doesn't really solve your organizational problem, right? Like you need to understand much more about DevOps, right? And sometimes people are receptive to that idea and we can sort of help them with that and introduce that to them. Other times, well, no, I really would just like the code on the box, please, right? And so, okay, well. So if you're into DevOps a lot, right? Maybe you have DevOps in your title, you're one of those people, right? We have a few of those here, I'm sure, have DevOps in their title. So you probably have a very strong feeling about this whole idea that like DevOps is just automation, right? Just configuration as code. And it isn't that, right? It's developers and operations people working together, right? You're tearing down barriers, so you're like making everyone work together. And the thing like it's funny to me is I sit in some of these conferences and I listen to people sort of wax poetically about this, and they say like that's the true meaning of DevOps is the culture, and you got to get that right. You're getting people to work together. And I think like, well, there's a fucking novel idea. Let's try to get people to work together. Like no one's ever thought of that before. And it's sort of odd. Like, I mean, getting people to work together is a good idea, right? Like I wouldn't argue against that. I don't actually think that has anything to do with technology per se, right? Like every company kind of wants people who work together, right? And can do a better job of that. I can tell you if you really can't work together with people, probably you're not going to have a good time no matter what business you're in. And truth be told, right, if you're trying to be a highly functional organization, again, in any business, right, trying to get cross-discipline teams to work together, that's an absolute must, right? Like, not that everyone's going to, go totally kumbaya and everything, but you've got to actually be able to work together. And people have been trying to solve that problem, I'm going to say at least since the 70s, because I believe all problems were solved in the 70s. Possibly even longer than that, though. I'm not 100% sure, but possibly even longer than that. And in trying to sort of solve this problem, right, like one of the things that comes out of that is having shared goals. Shared goals is huge for an organization. And it's sort of often really easily overlooked, which is a bit weird because you would sort of think like, hey, we all come here for a reason, and we have to think about what the goals of that are. And usually the goals seem very narrow. And I think there's a problem of sort of mixing or conflating the ideas of what your goals are with what your focus is, right? And one of the things that I try to sort of hammer home with people, right, is that focus is a different thing than what your goal is, right? So you can have devs who are focused on application, right, building software that way. Your ops are focused on providing reliable systems for the devs to run their apps on and working together. But in the end, they actually have the same goal. Certainly they should have the same goal, right? Their goal should not be to write software, and their goal should not be to keep the box up, right? That is not the goal of why you're doing what you're doing, right? The goal is to actually keep the business up and running, right? Keep it functional, keep things going. Similarly, if you're working on like open source infrastructure, I've done that for a number of open source projects, right? The goal is how do we keep the project moving forward, right? And the individual pieces that we work on, those aren't the goal, right? I've written like press releases for open source software, and my goal was really not to write press releases, right? But I understood that like if people are gonna know about this stuff, somebody has to do it. So I'm gonna go in and help with that, right? And that's not why I was there with the project, but again, somebody had to do it, and we have an overall organizational goal of that. So this is good, right? People think about this. And the more you look at that, and you probably start thinking like, well, this probably is how I think about this in my business. One of the key areas in getting people to work together, if you're talking about technology and you're thinking about this DevOps way, right, is actually application deployment and handoffs, right? And that's usually sort of the critical piece where app developers and ops people come together. You could kind of you could say like, well, we have different focuses, the same goal, but we don't actually ever have to talk together, except for this problem. You have to figure out how to do application deployment and handoff, right? Even if you're one of the people who are just like, DevOps is configuration management, right? Like, I just put Puppet on my systems and I'm DevOps. Even if you're that person, the funny part is that will help you with this problem, right? That will help you solve your handoff issues, right? The more automation you bring into it, the better off you will be, right? You'll get better, improved time to market when you have that. So even though sort of more high-minded DevOps individuals will look at the, maybe newbies and say, they think it's configuration management. They don't know. Like someday they'll know. I read the Phoenix project, right? Like I know what it's really about. They don't get that, like those people who haven't figured it all out yet, they're still gaining value from this process, right? So there's no sense to actually look down upon them or whatever. Like just realize like they haven't come as far as you perhaps, but they're still getting value, and so they're still doing good things. I heard a great quote here at the conference. I forget who said it, but it was, the difference between disaster and success is just missing the runway, right? And I thought about that. I was like, that's actually pretty brilliant, because essentially you're doing the same basic function, right? Like you're going to land the plane either way, right? Was Sully there? He landed the plane on the runway probably 1,000 times before he landed it in the river. But the time he landed in the river, like, hey, some things went wrong, right? I had to actually improve upon that. And so if you think about that, like, well, okay, let's go back to our DevOps, right? Let's think about the slight difference in how we look at this term of DevOps and the term dev and the term ops, right? So we always look at that and we say, well, I think dev means developers, right? People who write apps, probably web apps, but maybe services. We tend to think of ops as sysadmins and SREs, depending on the length of their beard. But I think, like, actually there's a sort of larger way to look at that, right? If you think about IT in general, right, there's a lot of people who are actually doing IT who are not devs or ops. And sometimes if you're in a small company, like this could be one person, right? But if you get into a larger company, this will be a lot of people. This will be teams of people, right? You'll have your QA team, your DBA team. They can be a tools team. If you call it a tools team, it's okay. If you call it a DevOps team, it's bad. Remember that. You'll have product managers. You won't have project managers, apparently, because I didn't put it on the slide. Sorry, Pat. You have support people out there, right, that are taking the calls or monitoring Twitter or whatever they're doing to see, like, hey, we're having problems and maybe we should let somebody know. Like, all of this can be a function of IT, and all of those are important for IT actually working, right? And if you look at the idea of, like, well, if we get automation as our first goal, right, DevOps is automation, and our second idea is, like, well, what it really is about is working together, right? The ideas of automation and working together are really just about creating efficiency, right? That's all people are trying to do. How do we get more efficiency? You know who wants to get more efficiency? Big A Agile wants to get more efficiency. Earlier this year, there was an Agile conference in this very same building. And if you went to certain floors here while you were here, you probably found a few people shivering in corners. I'm sorry, I made the Scrum Master mad. Big A Agile, they're all about efficiency. That is what they do. They have very rigid schedules that make sure that you are efficient no matter what happens, right? You get the points assigned, you go through the process, you are super efficient, and then you sit there and you reflect upon the efficiency which you have brought to your organization. It is a fantastic model for gaining efficiency, maybe. So Big A Agile really wants efficiency, but I would say actually everybody wants to be more efficient, right? If you hate Agile, or Big A Agile, you probably still want to be more efficient. You'd like more efficiency in your life. If you guys had better traffic efficiency, none of you would be here now. You'd all be going home, right? That's the life that we live. We don't have enough efficiency in our day-to-day operations. And I don't really care who you are in an organization, right? You can be CEO, CTO, whatever, all the VPs, all the directors, your salespeople, the marketing people, even the contributors on the team, they want more efficiency. Right? Everybody wants to be more efficient. They'd like for things not to be as hard as they are, right? When you say, I hate annual reviews, what you really hate is it's a really inefficient process. It doesn't really give me the benefit. There's an easy way to do this and be quick about it. I totally do that, right? Everybody wants more efficiency, right? Every business wants to be more efficient. It's kind of a universal thing. So think about efficiency and think about the world that we live in now, right? It is actually a very different world, even from 6 years ago when we started Surge, right? The current pace of technology is allowing for fundamental changes in how we do business, and it's also a fundamental change in how consumers expect to interact with businesses, right? The idea that now I'm going to order my pizza with emoji, right, on Twitter, that sounds crazy to even 2 years ago me, that anyone would want to do that. But if you think about it, hey, that is actually pretty efficient, right? If you can set that up, now I'm one click away from pizza, and that's not a bad thing. I haven't figured out how to do that with root beer yet. I need that, and bacon as a service. I need that, right? But anyway, so efficiency is a thing we definitely all want. Everybody's looking for it, and the world is kind of changing to be forced into that. And when we talk about DevOps, right, and we look at that label of DevOps, to me, what I'm always thinking is you need to get people, and I would say this sounds like it's not you, but this is also you, right? You need to get the people inside of companies to embrace the idea that IT is now a driver of what they're doing, right? Everything developed by IT is pushing that business forward, right? And we've had this struggle, certainly the ops folks have felt this, that IT is a cost center, right? It's a cost of doing business, and it's a thing that you're sort of wishing you didn't have to deal with. But if you look at the companies that are uber successful these days, right, it is central to what they are doing. It is central to how they are becoming successful, right? IT is no longer, sort of something that we'll figure out, something that we'll manage, right? It is the driver of your business operations at this point, right? And companies need to understand that, right? With this development that you have, that all companies have, whether it's integration or building new things or whatever, with that development that you have going on, without that development, there is no business operations, right? You take IT out of every business, and it starts to fall over, right? I was at a dinner earlier this week. I was lucky. I got my card slid through the machine before the card machine stopped working. There was another table who, a bunch of us left the restaurant, and 30 minutes later, I think everybody else showed up, and they're like, well, the POS system went down. So we all had to do the ka-chunk slide card reader thing on the paper. I was kind of surprised they actually still had that. I guess it's good that they did, right? But companies these days, we don't function without IT anymore. It's integral to everything. This also means that you people here need to come to terms with that idea as well, right? If you're working at a company that doesn't embrace that idea, your company is at a disadvantage because there are other companies in the market who have figured that out, right? And I know we would say that well, the problem is our business managers and our VPs and whatever, they don't understand what we do and they don't embrace this idea and the problem is on them. But I would say that I know I've looked at organizations where they've talked about the idea that product management and product owners are the first step in development, right? Because they're the ones who are actually going to look and see what the requirements are and tell you what you need to build in order to drive the business forward. and you go tell that to the application developers, and you go tell that to ops people, and you go tell that to DBAs, that like the first chain of what you're going to do is actually going to start with a product manager, and they generally don't like that idea either, right? They're sort of like, well, wait a minute, those are non-technical people. They don't know what we do, right? They don't have any part in this. And they're forgetting, right, the idea that actually that's what's driving all the things that you're working on. And I don't think you actually have to do this all yourself, right? If you're at a company and you're trying to figure out, like, how do we manage this balance, right? I would say, hey, it doesn't mean you have to build everything in-house, right? Every company has to have IT, but it doesn't have to be in-house. You can use software as a service, right? You can use outsource IT. Those things can help you. You figure out how to manage those things. You figure out how to integrate those things, right? The key is remembering technology is a first-class citizen for enabling business in the world today, right? So going back to that original thought, is Surge a DevOps conference? Well, it's not a conference where you go to convince yourself that everything is rosy, right? I think if you're a first-time Surge person and you've been to something like PuppetConf or ChefConf, like, love those guys, they're all good people, but you know when you go there, like, you're getting a certain spin on life, right? You're getting a certain look at how things are gonna work. Even worse, go to like one of those Amazon conferences where every talk is by an Amazon person, right? They're gonna tell you how awesome Amazon is. And when you come to Surge, you know what you're gonna hear about? Like, oh, look at that guy in the hallway who's working on his laptop because Amazon's failing right now, right? Like, Surge is not where you go to sort of think about how awesome the world is, right? I tend to think of it more like AA, probably in more ways than one, right? But like, we're all here because we've chosen a lifestyle that we think we all enjoy, and I think for the most part we do enjoy it. But that doesn't mean you don't need a coping mechanism, right? And so we try to give you one of those here at Surge, right? Like, that's a thing that we want you all to have. We want you to know you're not alone, right? That there are other people who have gone through this, and hopefully we can all work through it together. But as I said, I'm not a fan of labels, right? I'm not a fan of labels. So you probably will never hear me call it a DevOps conference, right? Again, I don't know, but I do think actually maybe it is the most DevOps of conferences that are out there, right? Because we focus on the things that are important to you, right? We know the work you do is important. We think about hard problems and how to solve them. We think about what are the important things that we need to work on, that we need to focus on, right? What do we learn about software by studying not just the guy who thinks it's running awesome, right? But the guy who's like, man, I ran into like these 7 bugs, and you can go check them out because they're on the web, and they're horrible, and I hope that someday there's a better answer, right? Hearing from practitioners who've actually been in the field, try to implement this stuff, not theoretically, but have actually been through it, right? Hearing them talk about their failures, talking about where things went wrong, trying to understand them. Key point, in the absence of sugarcoating, right? Getting that information from people, to me, ultimately, that's what empowers you, right? It helps make your life better in some way, helps the businesses that you're building, right? I think maybe that's DevOps, but I'm not a fan of labels. So for us, we just call it the Surge Conference. Thank you. Bye, Zach. We'll see you next year, everybody.